Hello, everyone, and welcome to set talk before the day before the new expansion goes live. So this is going to be a bit of a longer video, and it's mostly going to be talking about the I don't even know how many new sets there are. All the new sets and new toys that we're getting this expansion. So, with that said, we're just going to jump right into it, starting with Bog Raider. And I am using Allcast's ESO Hub website because it's accurate and it's this or try and flip through the game to do all of these, and this is just easier, especially since we have to talk about crafted sets. So, Bog Raider is max magicka, max health, and max stamina. And then, when an enemy you have recently damaged dies, gain 10 ultimate and increase your health recovery by 1056 for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. So this is an underperforming but easier to farm Drake's Rush or Arcasis. And I feel like that's going to kind of limit its usefulness in general, because we're going to pick Drake's Rush or Arcasis over Bog Raider every time because they're just more ultimate generation. Though the health recovery could be better on newer tanks, but you need to be damaging something and having it die, so it's only really good in fights where there's actually an ad to kill. Because of that, I don't think this is a terrible set, and I think that it's nice that we're getting a better Deadwater's Guile for tanks. I just don't think it's quite good enough to be run except in very specific situations. I think we have better sets to do this thing on tanks now, that we no longer need a Deadwater's Guile. But I do think that it's good to have this as, an overland set that you can get before going to farm Drake's Rush or Arcasis, especially if you're just starting out. Because overland sets are incredibly important for new player setups, and for talking about ease of access sets, because overland is the easiest thing to farm. Especially when you're alone. You can farm basically every piece of overland by yourself if you're at least decent. And you can probably get friends or just randoms in the same zone as you to help you farm for them if you need the help. So having Bog Raider and Frostbite, which we'll talk about in a minute because we're just doing these in alphabetical except for the trial sets, which we'll talk about as a group at the end. Having both Bog Raider and Frostbite as our overland sets is incredibly useful because it gives us this ability to have these sets as easy to access tools for whatever characters were either starting out or for newer players to grab onto. But I don't think Bog Raider is amazing, but I think it's at least decent from a new player perspective. Am I going to be farming it? Probably not. I have enough Arcasis to run Arcasis, and I think that this is just worse than Arcasis for what it's trying to do. But I do think if you're a newer player, Bog Raider is worth looking at. Deadlands Assassin is... My problem with this set... So... Weapon damage, max stamina. 5 items gives 200 weapon damage, and then dealing damage to an enemy within 10 meters of you with a heavy attack causes you to throw a cone of knives, dealing physical damage to enemies hit. If the enemy hit has 50% health or less, they also take an additional bleed over 13 seconds. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon and spell damage. So my biggest problem with this is that it's a 5-piece set for a heavy attack build. Alright? If we look at, really quick, sets, and a lot of the sets that are going to come up here have not actually been talked about on the show before. Because, well, heavy attack builds are this sort of weird zone where I'm not sure how to talk about them. Because on one hand, they're incredibly fun, and they tend to be very low API builds, so they can be really, really good for new players, and you'll actually see a couple of people whose recommendation for a newer player. I'm not looking for the Magicka versions, though. Noble Duelist and Undaunted Unweaver, which will come up later on here, are really good for a heavy attack mage. Here's one of the two. Here's the other. So, the big problem with Deadlands is that I think it's outperformed by what we already have for that setup. So Sergeant's Mail flat out increases the damage of your fully charged heavies. In Stormmaster, when you deal crit damage, your light and heavy attacks deal a massive extra amount. I don't know if Deadlands is good enough to replace Sergeant's Mail. It might be. It might just be good enough that we run Stormmaster Deadlands on heavy attack builds now for that extra physical damage burst. Because there is... Oh, okay. Although I have to wonder if the cone only happening every 15 seconds, especially on a heavy attack build where we need those heavy attacks, where we need that damage instantly, if Deadlands Assassin isn't too slow. Because these are the two go-to heavy Stam heavy attack sets right now. Sergeant's Mail, Stormmaster. Sometimes you'll see Stormmaster replaced with Undaunted Infiltrator from Arx Consortium. But for the most part, these two are your go-tos, especially since Sergeant's Mail, you can get a Might Maker from Wayrest 1, which is a two-handed greatsword that always drops in Precise, which is incredibly good for this style of build, because greatsword is just increased damage, and Precise is your best-in-slot trait for this build, because we want to be dealing crits with our Stormmaster. And Stormmaster does have 2 crit lines to help that. I think if Deadlands Assassin could deal this burst of the Cone of Knives more consistently, like, if the cooldown was only for the bleed, and not for the entire thing, I think Deadlands Assassin would be better. And I think I'd be more comfortable running Deadlands Assassin. Unfortunately, I think it's just overshadowed in its role by Sergeant's Mail and Stormmaster. And while I don't entirely want that, because this is a really cool set, and I like having cool sets, I just don't think it does enough, which is unfortunate. Alright, moving on. We have one of our mythic sets. Death Dealer's Fet. Gain a persisting stack of escalating Fet every 2 seconds you are in combat, up to 30 stacks maximum. Each stack increases your max stamina, health, and magicka by 88. You lose a stack every 4 seconds you are out of combat. I think that this is a better support tool than it is anything else. Now that I've looked at it again, and now that smarter people than I have gone over everything, I don't think this is a terrible mythic. And I think that there are definitely some really fun things you can do with having, 30 times 88 bonus max health, stam, and badge. This might actually be better in PvP than PvE, now that I think about it. It's another 2,640 max resource at maximum. And as long as you can maintain long, drawn-out fights or jump from ad pack to ad pack, you can just get that scaling higher and higher. I don't think this is necessarily a bad item. I don't think it's as good as I originally thought. I don't think it's the meta breaker. There is another mythic that I think is the meta breaker, which we will get to in a minute, and yeah, we'll talk about that. But I think that this is a nice midline mythic that has a good upside, a not really punishing downside, and is just kind of overall good. I don't think it's amazing, but I think it's good. Because it's not a massive buff, right? This isn't Thracian or Harpooners that's giving you a very obvious damage buff, but it is a very nice passive, especially in longer fights. It's just, you have to ask, is that extra 2,600 health, magicka, and stamina worth dropping a monster set for? And there are builds to which the answer to that is yes. And my gut instinct says to run this on like my solo wolf, because that could be interesting. But I also think that this isn't a strong enough buff to them, especially with Shapeshifter's Chain existing, which we'll get to in a minute. I don't know. It feels like it could be good, but it also feels like it's just sort of outclassed in everything you want it to do by something else. Because it's replacing either a 5-piece bonus or a monster set bonus. And for supports, that's incredibly hard to give up either of those. For DPS, you just run 1-piece Slime Craw in this, and that's fine. And solo builds, this is your mythic, which is problematic. I think this actually might be better in PvE than in PvP than PvE. The more I think about it, because especially if you can get if I think about running around the Imperial City, you could have a pretty decent max health buff as well as resource buff to try and push an advantage onto opponents while you're just, running around killing things in Imperial City. That could be interesting to try. I don't think it's good, but I think it's interesting to look at. I think Death Dealer's Fet is probably the weakest of the mythics this set at what it's trying to do, and I don't know. I want to like it. I want this to be good because it's a really cool effect, and it's not an overly punishing one. But I just don't think it's good enough. Alright. Moving on to our next set, Diamond's Victory. This is one of the crafted sets, and the reason we're doing this video on Allcast. ESO Hub, because Allcast is technically his other site. So this is one of the crafted sets coming out with Blackwood. It requires 5 traits to craft and is found in Pendrick Run, which is right about there on the map. Do you see why I wanted to use this for the video? Because it's just so much easier, especially for these crafted sets, because crafted sets are a pain. But weapon and spell damage, crit chance, weapon and spell damage, and then 5 items. While in combat, using ability with a range of 7 meters or less, grants range supremacy, adding 437 weapon and spell damage to your damage over time in ranged attacks. While in combat, using an ability with a range of over 7 meters gives melee supremacy, adding that damage to your melee attacks. I think this could be very good, and I think that there is definitely a place for a set like this. However, I think this set is more designed around being interesting than being good. And there is definitely a build that can make some disgusting use of this. And I am definitely not the person to try and find it. Because, I don't know. This is a set where something that might replace, for Dragon Knight specifically, this might replace Burning Spellweave for Ad Pulse, interestingly. I'm not confident on that, but I could see Diamond's Victory and what's it called? Mechanical Acuity as a new or at least an interesting ad pull meta, because you hit with an Impulse, which has a range of 7 meters. Right? Am I remembering that wrong? Skills, weapon, Destro Staff. Impulse has a range of 6 meters. So yeah, you do a Pulsar on yourself, and then possibly decrease the health of all adds around you. Give yourself range supremacy, and then give yourself melee supremacy with your light attack, and just have this massive 437 bonus to your damage, which is, again, I want to say comparable to Spellweave. Dungeon, Burning Spellweave, shouldn't be too far down here. 490. So we're losing a little bit on this, but I think Diamond's Victory might be able to edge it out if you're needing the extra time, right? Because Spellweave can occur once every 12 seconds and only lasts for 8. Diamond's Victory you can keep up indefinitely as long as you can keep casting the as long as you can keep triggering the ranged and melee supremacies. I should actually double check, because I don't know for sure if Diamond's Victory triggers off of light attacks. That's something that I just sort of assumed but never tested. So that's range supremacy, and that's melee supremacy. We do gain our melee supremacy from light attacks, and we can get range supremacy from something like Pulsar. So I think that this could be a decent mob clearing set. Do I think it's better than Burning Spellweave? Not really. Do I think it's an alternative if you don't want to A, farm Spellweave, or B, think your group could do better with a Pulsar? Sure, go for it. Otherwise, just run Burning Spellweave with Ellie Ring and it'll be fine. I think this set is interesting. I don't think it's quite top cut levels of good. Next up, we have the one set that I actually think is super good to come out of this expansion. Frostbite. And there are people watching this who are like, well, what about Harpooners? We'll get to Harpooners in a bit. I'm not happy about Harpooners, but I think it's powerful. So Frostbite is a super interesting and thematic set, and I love that not only is it thematic, it's also kind of good. And, to top all of that, it's an overland, which means we could probably make a mag den that only uses overland sets and have it be at least a little bit competitive. So, spell damage, spell crit, spell damage. Increase your damage done with frost abilities by 8%, increase your damage done against chilled enemies by 4%, and damage done against enemies afflicted with minor brittle by 2%. So, I think that, especially if you have a group that's keeping up brittle, if, for example, you have a mage den whose entire job it is to keep up the brittle debuff, or a tank or healer who is keeping up the brittle debuff, I think you'll do pretty well with Frostbite. And I think even without the brittle, as long as you yourself are keeping up chilled, your frost damage will be high enough that you'll be fine. And that's especially true if you end up running Crushing Shock as a spammable instead of Dive. Because that will have a little bit more frost damage, and you can run Frostbite. You can run Frostbite, the Ice Staff from, what's it called? Asylum Sanctorum, and Mother's Sorrow. And that actually might be a kind of fun build to test out next patch. Huh. Or maybe test out on the PTS before next patch comes out. Either way, I think I have high hopes for Frostbite. I don't think it's quite Sororia levels good, but I think it can be very, very good. It only has one crit line, so I don't think we can actually replace Mother's Sorrow with it. If it had two, I think it would always trump Mother's Sorrow. Even still it might, but I'm not confident in that statement. I still think Frostbite is a very, very good set, and I think this is one to keep an eye on. Next up, we have Gaze of Sithis. Add 3,276 max health, 1,025 health recovery, 4,000 armor, but reduce your block mitigation to 0. I like this as a more group available replacement for no one skills. Combat and gear. It feels like a more group-focused replacement to Ring of the Pale Order, which is getting changed from these numbers this patch. If we come back over here and grab our mythics out and look at the Markarth mythics, because Ring is one of the two from Markarth. Ring of the Pale Order restores 20% of the damage you deal as health. This value is decreased by 4% per ally you are grouped with, but you cannot be healed by anyone else. So, Ring of the Pale Order's changes means that it's an incredible solo tool, but it goes down in effectiveness the more friends you have. So I think that Gaze of Sithis is going to be the new best in slot for I really don't trust my team. Now, there are some obvious downsides. There are mechanics that will straight up kill you if you can't actually block the damage. But that extra 4,000 armor, 3,000 max health, and 1,000 health recovery are amazing for your survivability, and I think that on things like a heavy attack Sork, where you're running 2 one-piece crits anyways, or something like that, Gaze of Sithis isn't too much of an ask to just throw onto the build, and it's a ton of extra survivability if you're if you have a second person and therefore can't run like Pale Order. So I don't think this is terrible, but I think it's an interesting and good alternative to Ring of Pale Order. I just don't know if it's quite as good as I want it to be to run it more consistently. Especially since Ring doesn't add a piece of heavy armor to my build and lower my damage. Speaking of adding a piece of the wrong weight, let's talk Harpooner's Wading Kilt. Where do I begin with this set? Suppose we can begin by just saying what it does. Dealing direct damage grants you a stack of Hunter's Focus for 1 minute, up to 10 stacks maximum. You can only gain 1 stack of Hunter's Focus per second. Each stack of Hunter's Focus increases your critical chance by 125 and your critical damage by 1%. Taking direct damage removes 1 stack of Hunter's Focus up to 1 per second. Removing Harpooner's Wading Kilt removes all stacks of Hunter's Focus. So a couple of things. 1, we're hitting a max of 10 stacks, which is 1,250 critical chance and 10% bonus crit damage. So already, that is an extra minor force we're adding to our build. And almost an extra... I want to say that's a minor prophecy or a minor savagery. I will have to remember what in the game gives those buffs. I think your buff is brutality, so it won't tell me. Yeah, your minor brutality. Savagery is Nightblade, I think. One of Nightblade's things. Assassination, I'm guessing. Dealing crit damage grants you new group minor savagery, increasing your weapon critical by 1,314. Okay. So minor savagery and prophecy are 1,314. This is almost an extra minor prophecy or minor savagery and an extra minor force that can just be thrown into a build that already has both of those things. If you're in an organized group, you have minor prophecy or minor savagery from either your Nightblade or your sorcerer. You should have those either way. And you should be supplying yourself with minor force through either trap or critical acceleration. So this is just a massive amount of critical damage bonus. And for the record, if we're talking about existing things that this makes go crazy, where is it? Here it is. Mother's Sorrow, widely considered the best one of the best, if not the best, consistently good DPS sets in the game, is 1,528 spell critical. This is nearly as good as the 5-piece from Mother's Sorrow. I'd venture to say that there is definitely an argument to run this and 4-piece Medusa this set. If you're, admittedly, that would probably ask for dual daggers. But I think if we can get I think that with a 4-piece Medusa, especially if Medusa was a light set, I'd say that's 100% the run. But Medusa, getting that 4-piece and then Harpooners would be insane. It does mean that we're wearing a medium piece, because Harpooners only comes in medium because it's a mythic. But I think that's okay. So, for those of you who were around when Greymore came out and were paying attention to high-level metas at that point, You remember what Thracian did. What happened with Thracian Stranglers coming out. Harpooner's Waiting Kilt is the new Thracian. And they've hit it once, but I don't think they hit it strong enough. And I hate to do this, but I don't actually know how to change this to make it not the new Sororia or Reliquant. And I kind of hate to say that, but it's true. I think this is the new best in slot for any and every DPS. Which means that these are going to be figured out very, very fast. Because everyone and their brother is going to want Waiting Kilt, and once we know where to farm it, all of those things are going to die instantly, over and over and over again. This set is going to be the new, do you have this yet? How do we help you get this? This is... And the other thing is, if you remember, for those of you that do remember Thracian, you probably also remember that it wasn't actually that common with every DPS. Because it reduced your health. It reduced the amount of health you currently had. So you were still playing at low health, but if you were good enough, you could live through it. Harpooner's downside is just losing some of the potential you've built up, and it only triggers off direct damage, which you probably won't take a ton of anyways. So you can get these incredibly high damage things with this really, really easy to build up thing, because again, this will build up off of your light attacks. It's incredibly powerful. I think it's probably the most powerful set to come out in Blackwood. And that's including all the trial sets. I think it's powerful, and I think it's really, really, really good. I don't think it's healthy for the game. So yes, incredibly powerful. If you want max power, get Waiting Kilt, but you probably already knew that, so we're going to move on. Heartland Conqueror. This is a funny set. This is one of those sets that's funny, but probably not good. Weapon and spell damage, max magicka, max stamina, increases the effectiveness of your weapon traits by 100%. So what is this good for? Well, we need weapon traits to be good for our build. So this can be a pretty decent buff to our crit chance if we're running like precise weapons. It can be a rather large buff to our XP if we're running, say, training weapons. That's actually probably what I'm going to end up using Heartland for, because I'm going to put it as the second set in all of the characters I'm currently leveling with training, and give them training weapons and call it a day. Because that seems like the best plan here, right? You get an extra 8% XP, which is probably the most effective way to use Heartlands. Because this 5-piece... So it reminds me of Twiceborn Star, right? Which is a craftable set in Cragworn. That's just... I want it to be good. Where is it? Twiceborn. Twiceborn Star. You can have 2 Mundus Stones at the same time. And otherwise, it's pretty comparable to Heartland, except that Twiceborn has a max health line, and this has a weapon and spell damage line. I think that this is a very fun gimmick. I don't think it's an actual, like, good set. Because I don't think that this is consistently worth a 5-piece. I think that if they had gone and said, this is a 3-piece crafted set with just the weapon and spell damage and this, that it would be much better, but I also think it would be way too... it might be a little bit too good at that point. I do really like Heartland Conqueror, though. I love this idea. It's hard to justify it. On to our last crafted set, Hits Whisperer. And this is the one that I think might actually be one of the better sets. So, health recovery, stamina recovery, magicka recovery. Dealing damage with a light or medium attack heals you for 1,318 health and restores 1,318 stamina and magicka. Dealing damage with a fully charged heavy attack heals you for 6,306 health and restores 6,306 stamina or magicka. For an explanation as to what a medium attack is, so this is a light attack, this sort of just instant click. This, if you fully charge it, a heavy attack, a fully charged heavy attack is what the game will refer to as a heavy attack. If you don't fully charge it, like this is what they're referring to as a medium attack. Somewhere between light and heavies. I want to like this set. I want to like this set, and I want to recommend it as a sustain tool on newer players, especially newer tanks. Because it teaches you to light attack between it. It helps teach that light attack weaving that's super important for ult generation on tanks. I don't know if it's quite good enough. It's a cool option, and it's a really nice teaching option, but I don't know if it's quite up to snuff. And that kind of saddens me, because this is a very cool set. And I just don't know if it's quite on level with the others. And for our last mythic, we have Shapeshifter's Chain. Reduce the cost of your transformation ultimate abilities by 15%. While transformed, increase your maximum health, stamina, and magicka by 1707. So I mentioned this in passing when we were talking about Death Dealers. Because Death Dealers gives a similar amount at maximum stats, which means that Death Dealers might be our choice for non-transformations, while we take Shapeshifter on transformations for that style of thing. So, for the record, transformation ultimates are Werewolf, Vampire Lord, and Scion. Not Scion, Goliath. So, you have the Bone Goliath from you have this monstrosity, the Bone Goliath, that comes from Necromancer. You have Swarming Scion, which is admittedly, with the right morph choices, is basically the same thing as that Bone Goliath. Except one's a Actually, what is the difference between them? Oh! Goliath is a better tank one, while Scion is a better DPS one. Because Goliath scales off your max health, light attacks restore health, and heavy attacks restore more health. Whereas, I can't pull it up on here, but if we look at Skills, World, Vampire, Swarming Scion. Well transformed, your max health, magicka, and stamina are increased by 100k. You heal for 15% of all damage you deal. You can see enemies through walls. Bats and the morph makes bats swirl around you, dealing 1,456 magicka damage every second. So, it's about the same amount of damage. Roughly. But Ravenous Goliath is a massive health buff and a massive heal, while Swarming Scion is still a massive heal, but it does not give you quite as much maximum health. I think. Am I looking at that right? Yeah. It doesn't give you quite the max health, but it gives you more healing if you're a DPS. Also, don't go to perfect. Don't even bother with perfect Scion. It's not as good because you don't have the free damage. Swarming is just the better morph. But, in those... So, those two will get more use out of the reducing the cost the cost reduction of Shapeshifter's Chain, because these have a limited duration. You've got 20 seconds on Goliath, and 20 seconds on Scion. But for our other transformation skill line, we have Werewolf, which lasts 30 seconds, but can more or less be extended indefinitely as long as you're eating corpses and dealing damage. It is very, very hard to drop out of werewolf form unless you want to, if you don't want to. And because of that, as long as you can, start whatever you're doing in werewolf with an ethereal well, and you can keep it running, the reduced cost isn't as important on a werewolf. So, however, this magicka health and max health, stamina, and magicka is less important to the our vampire, is a little bit less important to our vampire specifically, and to both in general, because you're not doing these for the max resources as much. You're doing them for the you don't get to kill me, Karker. Both of these ultimates are very much I only die if I want to. Or I only die if I don't have it. And while I think both of them are amazing for that, I also think that you don't actually get much out of this transformed thing. Or at the very least, you don't get as much out of it as you would with werewolf. I suppose that this is one where either morph has its advantages and disadvantages. I like Berserker for more DPS-focused characters. Pack Leader can be really good is mostly good for a werewolf tank, because it gives the same buff as Yolnahkrind while you're transformed, which is really good. But Berserker is just so much more damage So I do think Shapeshifter's Chain is good. And it's very fun. I like Shapeshifter's Chain. And I'm definitely going to farm it and put it on my werewolf and run around doing werewolf things, because why the heck wouldn't I? It's awesome. But do I think it's a best in slot skill? Best in slot thing? Heck no. This is specific to werewolves, vampires, and bone Goliaths. If you're seeing this anywhere as a best in slot, you're probably looking at either PvP things or being very silly. Or both. I'm not going to discount both. But this is good. This is good for those specific builds, and I think it's good to have in the game for those specific builds. And I am definitely going to be farming it, because I like my werewolf. Werewolf is very fun for me. And then we get on to our trial sets. So when I pull these up, I'm going to be pulling them up as the perfected versions. For all of these, if you're running it on normal, ignore the first sentence, everything before the comma, for whatever set we're looking at. So first off, Bonsi's Mania. Spell damage, minor slayer, spell critical, spell damage, and increase your damage done to non-player enemies by up to 15% based on your current missing magicka. So this is apparently comparable to Sororia, which is insane to me. Because Sororia has been literally the best magicka DPS set since I started playing this game. And Bossi's doesn't really seem like it's good enough until you think about how much a straight 15 damage increase can be. Like, there is an actual argument in certain groups, in certain setups, where having 3 people straight up run Master Architect, which is a trial set that we're going to pull up here. Halls of Fabrication. Having 3 DPS literally wear Master Architect, or a healer and 2 DPS, to try and keep up a high uptime on that Major Slayer to get the 10% damage increase. This is also why groups run the set Roaring Opportunist, which comes from Kind's Aegis. Where, after completing a fully charged heavy, you and up to 5 group members gain Major Slayer for 1 second for every 600 spell damage or 6,300 magicka you have. Roaring Opportunist can only affect the target every 22 seconds, max duration 12 seconds. Yorvald pushes that up to 16.8, and sitting at that 16.8 isn't the toughest thing, but you do kind of have to work towards it. Specifically, the build that I have to run Roaring right now is a... Words are hard. The build that I have that's working towards Roaring right now uses major sorcery potions as well as infused spell damage jewelry to get there. But it is, it is good. And there's something fun about out-DPSing some of the DPS as a healer on those rare days where everything lines up and you have a really bad DPS in the party. But I think that if you're hovering around the point where you're getting that 15%, I think Bonsies will outperform Sororia, or at least be on par. Which is funny, because that means that I will definitely run it on Dragon Knights, just so that I can say I'm not running Sororia. Because there is something immensely fun to me about not running the Cloud Rest sets. But I don't think it's bad. I'm not confident. I don't think it's bad, I'm not confident in how good it is. Because it runs into a similar problem that we had with Pearls, where you have to be at that low magicka for it to matter. And if you're at that low magicka, you're gonna have a bad time. Especially since your healers tends to run like 3 different sets between... Especially since at least one healer is probably running 3 different sets to help keep your magicka higher than that. And the other one's probably also running a set to try and keep your magicka higher than that. And I can pull up the sets that those would be. We might actually be talking about one of them in a minute here. Because part of being a healer is making sure that your DPS have the resources to continue DPSing. Next up is Saxhleel Champion. Maximum Magicka, Minor Aegis, Max Stamina. Perfected adds Max Stamina, and then both have, when you use an ultimate ability while in combat, you and up to 11 group members within 28 meters gain Major Force for 1 second per 15 ultimates spent, increasing your critical damage done by 20%. This is... We pair this with Drake's Rush, and we run it on Necro Tanks with Colossus. So this lets us drop Warhorn from a Necro Tank. And if I could figure out a way that I liked front barring and back barring a set, I would back bar front barring and back barring a 5-piece. I haven't quite figured out how I want to go about that yet. Because there aren't a lot of... I mean, could throw in... I'll have to figure out exactly how to set it up, but... Saxhleel front bar... Or Saxhleel back bar, Arcesis front bar, or Saxhleel... Or Arcesis back bar, Saxhleel front bar, or Saxhleel front... Or Saxhleel back bar, Drake's Rush front bar. Both could be very, very good for this sort of just constantly building ultimate. Add on to that the fact that we're a necromancer, so we have necrotic potency, could throw pearls on for that. And you could do some really interesting work with Saxhleel Champion. And I think that losing the extra resources from Warhorn is fine when we're getting essentially a Warhorn. The other thing we can do with this is, instead of running this with an ultimate building thing, we can run it with weapons and jewelry of the set Yorvald's Guidance, which I mentioned in passing when we were talking about earlier about the when we were talking about Bonsies and Major Slayer. Yorvald's increases the duration of major buffs, minor buffs, and damage shields that we apply by 40%, which
which makes me think about Sax Little Champion, Yorvald's Guidance, Colossus, and Barrier on a Necro Tank. Because the Barrier is going to put out an insanely high damage shield. Because you can hit 40 or 50k damage shields with Yorvald's and Barrier. And that, a well-timed Yorvald's Barrier is insane. Sax Little Champions, and Sax Little Champion basically makes Barrier also give Warhorn for a rather ridiculously long time with Yorvald's. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was still pretty darn good for it. And I think this might become the new Necro Tank meta. And I don't know if that's going to make Necro Tanks meta, or like everyone runs Necro Tank. Because Colossus is without a doubt the most powerful class ultimate in the game. Because the ability to apply major vulnerability consistently is amazing. And if you can keep that major vulnerability up and on the target at all times, this is insane. And the big thing that Sax Little Champion gives us is it gives us the ability to do that on a tank if we don't have enough Necros in the party otherwise, and not lose out on the major force from Warhorn. Which we would be doing otherwise. It could prove very interesting. I don't know that it's the best, but I think it's at least worth remembering and worth looking at. On to Stone Talker's Oath, the set that I am actually incredibly excited about. Magicka Recovery, Minor Aegis, Magicka Recovery. Perfected adds maximum Magicka. And your fully charged heavy attacks place a soul bomb on your target that charges as the target takes damage. After 10 seconds, the bomb explodes, restoring 5% of the damage received as stamina and Magicka, up to 2,240 stamina and Magicka to 12 group members within 16 meters of the explosion. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. Some of you are probably looking at this and saying, isn't that just kind of Hollow Fang, but worse? Well, yes and no. So, Hollow Fang is the current go-to sustain set. Hollow Fang's Thirst. When he critically healed or critically deal damage a target, spawn a ball of hemoglobin at their location. After 2 seconds, it explodes, restoring 2,523 Magicka and applying minor vitality to you and your group members within 6 meters of the ball for 9 seconds. This effect can occur once every 9 seconds. So it's a very good and rather easy uptime to get going. And it's a combination of the Magicka Restore, which is very good, and the minor vitality, which is also very useful in specific situations. And like, if you look down here, it's on every one of Allcast's build guides. But Allcast is a DPS main, so take everything you see there with a grain of salt. There are no good build guides for healers, and I don't feel like I know enough to actually talk much about them. I wish I did. If I did, I would legitimately just turn this channel into a healer thing. But I am not a good or knowledgeable enough player to talk about that. But this is the Resource Restore from Hollow Fang, which is good, because this upcoming patch is having Hollow Fang's buff. This is getting halved in the next patch, down to like 1,200 magicka. Because, well, Hollow Fang is in every group right now. And and part of it might be to make Stone Talker appealing. I'm not entirely sure whether the extra, 1,000 or so resources is going to put Stone Talker over Hollow Fang. At least in fully Magicka groups. If we've got a stamina group I think that Stone Talker might end up being a backbarred set for your healers. Or if you've got a mixed group as well, I think we backbar Stone Talker so that we can get that heavy attack that restores resources. Just work that in on the boss every 10 seconds. Switching to your backbar to heavy attack every 10 seconds isn't the biggest ask. I mean, it is much more work than Hollow Fang. Because the good thing about Hollow Fang is that it just sort of happens as you play the game. Because you're not required to think about whether or not Hollow Fang is active all the time. It just it happens whenever you get a crit. So as long as you've got a decent crit chance, which you should, you're going to be getting those heals out. And that minor vitality can actually be very helpful in specific situations. Now, again, I think Stone Talker's Oath is good, and I think it's the better Hollow Fang in a mixed group, because it can also, what we run in a Stam group, though I'm not positive about that because there are too many stamina sets to try and buff stamina damage that need to get put on people. But it is good resource regen, and Hollow Fang's getting nerfed. Stone Talker might be one of our new best-in-slot heal sets this patch. It's a little early to tell. That said, the minor vitality from Hollow Fang might still keep it in as best in slot. I don't know how much that's actually important. And also, the 2 lines of spell critical are very nice, because crit healing is more useful than people like to think it is. And finally, Sul'Zan's Torment, the stamina set that is completely forgettable. Weapon damage, Minor Slayer, weapon critical. Perfected adds another line of weapon critical. When an enemy you recently damaged dies, they leave behind a Vengeful Soul for 6 seconds. You can only create 1 at a time. Increases your weapon critical by, that number is wrong, and your crit damage by 12%. Let's look at what that actually does. Because there's no way it increases your weapon critical by 0 when that got into the game. Weapon critical by 2,160. Okay. So, with that noted, that is an extra major savagery for you. And it's an extra better minor force for you. If you remember what we talked about on Waiting Kilt, those are both very good. However, when an enemy you recently damaged dies, we need ads to be a thing for this to come up. And ads aren't a consistent enough thing that I feel comfortable saying that Sul'Zan's Torment is going to be good. I think it's a very good AoE set. I don't know that it's quite... I don't know if it's actually good enough to topple Kinra or not. I actually don't know if it's good enough to topple Kinra. I don't think it's consistent enough to topple Kinra in trial setups. I could see running this in dungeons, though, because you're more likely to get that last hit. Or there's more ads, and especially if you guys are sprinting through, the 30-second duration on this could mean you can push further and further to between each fight and try and just burn everything down. This might be the new, like, Locestes dungeon set. Because a lot of people run Locestes in dungeons as SAM DPS. Actually, this might be our Locestes pairing in dungeons. Because that could be something interesting to test. Because it's sort of... you run Locestes as a sort of, like, selfish thing for dungeon DPS, because you're getting Minor Slayer, and when you activate a synergy, you gain Major Slayer, and as long as your healer is putting out orbs, you're fine. It's not bad. I don't know if I think Solzon's Torment is actually good enough to make the cut.
Because I worry about the phrasing, about the trigger not being, like, consistent enough. Because it's a snowball, right? And you have to be where the guy fell, which you're a STAM DPS, so you're probably in melee anyway, so that's fine. But I don't know. It worries me. And I don't think it's good enough, which means that we still don't have anything that can keep up with Reliquin. Yay! Oh, Reliquin. Anyways, that is going to be it for for today's video. I will see you all Friday for Left of Meta. I hope you all enjoy Blackwood, and thank you all for watching, and I will hope to see you in the next one. Until then, good luck, stay safe, and don't die.